Hi, Mandy. Looks like we're just waiting to see if others join us today, but feel free to unmute, introduce yourself, or put in the chat what brought you here today. And I'll wait a couple more minutes to see if more participants arrive.
I'm good, thank you.
And I think we'll give it a couple more minutes, but if anybody would like to put in the chat box what brought them here today, maybe talk about your students within CPS, and we'll wait a couple more minutes here to see if more participants arrive, and I'll get started. And I've gone ahead and anyone can unmute. I think I've got the settings here. Jump in with any questions as we're going along. This is kind of a information heavy webinar. So please feel free to unmute and ask any questions as we're walking through. I'll give it one more minute here and then we'll get started. And it's looking like maybe the question and answer chat is the chat that's working for today. So if you can see the question and answer chat box, and that should be a place to enter information. Let me see. Okay, so let's see if the chat box is working. Great, thanks. Okay. Thank you, Anna. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and get started. I'll start walking through, and like I said, anyone who wants to chime in at any time with any questions, you should be able to unmute and or use the chat box. So this is the nuts and bolts of navigating special education in Chicago Public Schools. Feel free to enter into the chat box what your role is as it relates to students with disabilities. If you're a parent, teacher, advocate, or your age of student and your number of years with experience in CPS. Today's agenda, we're going to run through essentially a very brief introduction of your rights, your basic rights for special education, the difference between an IEP and 504. We're going to list some of the acronyms within special education and CPS acronym soup because they like to use their own acronyms to make it even more difficult. And a brief overview of the organization chart and organizational structure within ODLSS, some of the relevant departments. Going to review the Family Advisory Board, parent involvement specialists and their role, ISB monitoring of special education, who you go to at your local school for questions and support, some general LRE programming within CPS, and then we're going to touch on budgeting, but go over common concerns and possible solutions. And my hope is that we can spend a lot of time. Again, I'm going to walk through these slides. Feel free to jump in with questions as we're walking through, and we'll definitely have time at the end to talk about any concerns and questions that arise. So I'm Christine Palmieri. I'm an educational advocate with Matt Cohn and Associates. I have experience advocating for families in Chicago public schools. I have a 15-year-old son who's autistic, and he now attends a therapeutic day school. I've been a member of SPEAK, the Special Education Advocacy Coalition of Chicago, for the past 5+ years. We've advocated on behalf of CPS families for the ISB corrective action, which followed the CPS systemic special education violations. ISB student-specific corrective action resulted in over $22 million in remedies to families that were impacted by these violations. And I'm currently a CPS Board of Education Special Education Committee member as well. So our basic special education rights, and I'll run through this fairly quickly, but there's a right to identification and evaluation to determine if a child has a disability, including your school's obligation for child find. Your student has a right to free and appropriate public education. You'll hear this referred to as FAPE, and that includes special education and related services. You have a right to services in the least restrictive environment, the LRE, and we'll talk a little bit about how CPS approaches LRE programming as we go through. You have a right to parental participation in the entire process, and a right to your procedural safeguards, including access to information, participation in meetings, consent to evaluations and services, right to withdraw consent. And I've linked throughout this presentation, which we'll provide after, I've linked quite a few informal resources. So here is the CPS procedural manual, or documents are found there. Some of them are informal, some are formal. The CPS website and the ODLSS website is pretty difficult to navigate, and there can be repeated and misinformation available on it. So I've tried to link the updated links here. And every family has a right to mediation and due process, and to complaints to ISB if there's a disagreement about the school's actions. The IEP, an individualized education plan, is a plan or program developed to ensure that the child who has a disability is identified under the IDEA law and attending elementary or secondary educational institution, that they're receiving specialized instruction and related services via goals. A 504 plan is a plan developed to ensure that a child who has a disability identified under Section 504 is attending elementary or secondary educational institution receives accommodations that will ensure their academic success and access to the learning environment. And I've included some links to some of our presentations. Here is the key differences between IEPs and 504 plans. So there are many acronyms in the special education world, and CPS likes to make it even more complicated by having their own acronyms. So these are just a list of some. For example, FAPE, Free and Appropriate Public Education. IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. LRE, Least Restrictive Environment. A BIP is a behavior intervention plan. And then on the other side, we have all of the CPS-based acronyms. So ODLSS is the Office of Diverse Learner Services and Supports. DL is a diverse learner. SECA is a special education classroom assistant. That's also known as a para or an aide. SBSS is the Specialized Behavioral Support and Strategy Team. The CATS team is a citywide assessment team. And we'll go over some of these as we walk through. But your school might have an LSC, which is a local school council. So there's a lot of added information that CPS has their own acronyms for, so it can be really hard to navigate. And this presentation will be available after, and each of these slides will be available as well. And some of those clickable links are all embedded in that slide. So this is a very broad overview of the organizational structure within CPS. I'm going to move on to the second slide here. So there's the CPS Board of Education, and the Board of Education essentially oversees the Chicago Public Schools. They've just created a Special Education Advisory Committee, which is specifically to support the district in advising regarding special education. Our CEO is Pedro Martinez. The CEDO, which is a Certified Education Officer, is Bogdana Chumkovova. She is a prior special education teacher herself. She is sometimes someone who would be beneficial to reach out to if you are having concerns at your local school. And I've gone through some of the other roles here. Specifically, currently, ODLSS has an interim chief. His name is Richard Smith, and he's very helpful. They're currently looking for a new full-time chief. The deputy chief, Ricardo Trujillo, is also helpful. So these are some of the emails where if you need to reach out or go up sort of the chain in CPS, these are all people who you can reach out to. ODLSS has an executive director of operations, Wayne Williams. And then there's other various roles. These are all located in central office downtown. They're managerial roles. There's a director of instructional quality. There's a manager of procedure and policies. Each related service provider has a manager, and then there's a director of the related service provider managers. So there are hierarchies and steps that you can go up as you have concerns, and we're going to outline how to do that further in the presentation. ODLSS has district representatives. They're called DRs, and those are admin level support people to provide policy and procedural supports to your local IEP team. So they are located in central office, but they are available to families and IEP teams to provide procedural and policy support. ODLSS also has special education administrators. They're called Cs, and they can provide instructional support to teams. So that's, how are we implementing these goals? How are we working on, specific curriculum and modifying and accommodating it? There's a link here that allows you to search for your school's DR and C. So each network will have a DR, 1 or 2 DRs, and each network will have a C. And I'll just add a caveat that some DRs are amazing and can provide a huge level of support for teams, and some district representatives are newer, so they have less training and availability, and sometimes they can't be as helpful. Each network also has a chief. So you might hear sometimes reference to your school's network chief. A network chief is basically over the principals in the network, and they can be hit or miss for support. They don't always know the intricacies of special education. So we're going to walk through some of the departments within CPS. ODLSS has their early childhood department. So, they have developmental screenings and assessments for that transition from early intervention into pre-K. And there are some links here for where you can get screenings, the child find obligation information, And then CPS has a child find coordinator, and their email is here that you can reach out to for support. So there should be a successful transition from early intervention to early childhood within CPS. And the evaluations for a student who's new to CPS coming into pre-K level are done through what they call the CATS team. So it's a citywide assessment team. And that team does evaluations in an expedited manner. Sometimes it might be that you go in on a Saturday and you spend, 5 or 6 hours there. They meet with your child. They walk through a full and complete special education evaluation. You meet, you discuss, eligibility and create an IEP all within the same day. And for pre-K, and, we'll go over the different options for programming, but the citywide assessment team is sort of the vessel to get into the system. And there's links there about their information. Getting into pre-K, CPS has interesting program models that are unique to CPS, of course. There's preschool itinerant services. There is an inclusive, or what they call a blended program. So that blended program may have a mix of students receiving special education support from a special education teacher in the classroom and gen ed students. And then there are preschool programs with intensive support. So that's more like a separate classroom with students all receiving special education support. There are links throughout, like I said, there are links throughout this presentation to some of the CPS materials. Can't say that the CPS materials are easily accessible or manageable, but there's a map here of those early childhood specialized programs. There's inclusive instructional, there's full and half day programs. The maps are a little bit hard to navigate, but I've linked it here. So the early childhood school assignment, and this is unique to CPS as well, but it's not always a situation where you can just go to your neighborhood school, sign up for pre-K and attend. The school assignment does go through downtown for students with disabilities, and we'll talk more about that school assignment office as we go on. I've linked some parent supports here. StarNet is a phenomenal organization that supports families with young children. They're going to be age birth through 8 years old, and they can provide information, trainings, and workshops, etc. And they partner with CPS. So when we talk about all of the different programs that Chicago Public Schools offer, there are multiple. And this is an example of the linked map that shows the location and the types of programs that are available. This map also is not very easy to navigate through, and it can be really difficult the way that it's laid out. So we've asked for some revisions on it. We'll see if they come to fruition. For example, it's not interactive, which would be really helpful for families, but the map is available. So ODLSS, the way that they break down LRE and the way that they describe certain programs, again, it's very specific to CPS. So sometimes it can be confusing as a new family. For example, they use the word blended pre-K. That's a pre-K classroom that has a special education teacher in it and a mix of students with disabilities and gen ed students. In your local neighborhood school, you may have a co-taught classroom where that classroom is the gen ed curriculum, and there's a general education teacher and a special education teacher teaching side by side, co-teaching. You may have a pulled out separate classroom. Perhaps maybe your child is receiving reading instructional support in a pulled out classroom with other students with disabilities. And it's important to note that, yes, you can have, or a school can provide, pulled out services for social studies and science in addition to math and reading in your neighborhood school. There's also what they call a cluster classroom. So a cluster classroom is a student who has in their IEP the LRE grid that shows 61% or more of their day spent outside of the gen ed setting. It's outside of the pulled out setting. They're in a separate classroom. Typically, there are 13 other students in this classroom with one special education teacher and one or two programmatic aides. So these students receive all of their academic instruction in that cluster setting, and then they have specials or recess with their gen ed peers. There are also multi-sensory clusters like McPherson or Kilmer, or deaf and hard of hearing classrooms. The school assignment team in ODLSS places students in these cluster classrooms. It may not be a cluster classroom at your neighborhood school. So, for example, when your student has been identified as requiring a cluster classroom, it then shifts from your local team to downtown and the school assignment team, who will look at your students' needs, look at the availability within the cluster classrooms throughout the district, the distance from your home, and they will assign you a school. There are also transition clusters. So they're a special education program for high school students or students who are 18 to 22 years old that may have mild or moderate cognitive disabilities. And those programs focus on transition to becoming members of the community. For example, those schools are Vaughan Occupational, Northside Learning Center high schools, and then Southside Occupational and Ray Graham have services for students 18 to 22. Another, your student maybe require a therapeutic day school setting. So that's a non-public setting, tuition paid by CPS. There's also home and hospital instructional programming. CPS now has Virtual Academy, which is sort of came out of the pandemic, and some students may be attending Virtual Academy, and there's a link there to learn more about that. And then some students may require residential therapeutic school. So some of the relevant departments within CPS, we talked a little bit about the citywide assessment team and how their process, it's still a full IEP team, students who are either coming in via pre-K, maybe they've moved to the district and are brand new, a student who's attending a private school, but still requires a CPS IEP, can go through this citywide assessment team. The school assignment team, that's where we talked about if your student requires a cluster placement, that is a challenging process. And I've listed the managers here, Cynthia Sanders and Tora Evans. So the school assignment process can sometimes be a little bit slow, a little bit cumbersome, and we talk about later on your options if you receive a school assignment that you don't agree with. I've listed the transportation department. The manager is Kimberly Jones. We all have a lot of questions about transportation quite often, and sometimes it's easier to reach out directly to the manager. ODLSS has a phenomenal department, the Specialized Behavioral Support and Strategy Team. They call it the SBSS team. The SBSS team is made up of BCBAs, a board certified behavioral analyst, and RBTs, which are registered behavior techs. They're housed in central office, but they're available to assist students and staff district-wide. Then they provide appropriate educational, behavioral, environmental, and social supports to students with IEPs and 504s. And they can also provide your school team with support in developing, implementing an FBA or developing a BIP, a behavior intervention plan. Other relevant departments include the Assistive Technology Resource Center, transition services for those students who are looking for post-secondary education, job development activities, living skills training, community-based instruction. Sometimes you may need to reach out to the Office of School and Safety Security, and the manager is Jadine Chow. And I've listed the Office of Access and Enrollment. So the OAE office manages and oversees the applications, testing, selection, and transfer process for enrollment and GoCPS. And GoCPS and its interaction with, LRE and what our students may need can be really complicated within the district. So I just want to touch shortly on special education budgeting. So special education positions They include special education teachers and paraprofessionals and SECAs in our local schools. The special ed positions are awarded to schools on a need basis based on how the IEPs are written and how many minutes, et cetera. The budgeting for special education is not it is not commingled with the general education budget. Positions are allocated and funded separately by central office. So if students are, if services are added to a student's IEP during the school year, like they now need an aide, or if new students enroll and they need extensive amounts of pullout time, throughout the school year, a principal can request additional positions from central office at any time. Separately from that process, CPS provides schools with the following year's budget each spring and early summer. So you may hear your local school council, your LSC, discussing special education position cuts. Either positions are added or cut. And if you have position cuts that you feel your school needs, so if, for example, if they have, if they're not allocated the same number of special education teachers or the same number of paras, principals can submit a budget appeal. And that is a request for their position allocation to be reviewed or have positions restored. And often the administrator may meet with the district representative to review the teacher and aide schedules. And it's really important here within your IEPs, for example, if your student doesn't do well with transitions, it's okay to list in the IEP that you want to limit the number of adults working with your student during each day. So for example, it's important to only have 2 different paras each day instead of them maybe having 3 or 4. And running for your school's local school council or attending LSC meetings or starting a diverse learner committee under your LSC are some ways to help advocate for the positions that your school needs. There are other resources like the ODLSS parent specialists. So ODLSS provides parent involvement specialists, and they work towards creating collaborative relationships between families of diverse learners, the advocacy agencies, educators, admin, and your local school. So they can support you in IEP meetings. They can support you from behind the scenes. They have a hotline that you can call with any questions that you may have. And right now there are 2 parent involvement specialists, Michelle Burgess and Natasha Croft, and their information is here. And they can really be very helpful. They can be a wealth of information. And again, they can help to attend IEP meetings with you and just help to ensure that your voice is heard. We also there is an ODLSS Family Advisory Board. It's now called the VAB. It is an advisory board. It's a community of families, all with diverse learner students who have a shared interest in collaborating with ODLSS to support those students and enhance special education supports and services. There are monthly meetings. Oftentimes there are trainings, just sort of general public comment, et cetera. So they can be a great opportunity to participate. And I'm just going to circle back on this term, diverse learner. So that is an acronym, a CPS-based acronym. And I think it's challenging because every student is essentially a diverse learner. However, every student is not a student with a disability. So we'd prefer if they use the terminology Office of Special Education and student with a disability. But as I go through this presentation, I'm going to use their terminology of diverse learner. I think that's really challenging because oftentimes families immediately don't fully know what diverse learner is and don't understand that it's special education. So I'm touching here a little bit on an ISB inquiry and corrective action and monitoring. So the Illinois State Board of Education years ago created a public inquiry where they found that CPS had committed various procedural violations, and they implemented a corrective action that they called SSCA, Student Specific Corrective Action, and there's some information here on that. Some of the challenges that families were experiencing were district representatives attending meetings, telling a team that they could not identify the need for a paraprofessional, or a district representative telling a team that they could not identify a need for a therapeutic day school, or that certain steps had to be taken before, or a cumbersome amount of data needed to be collected before a decision could be made. And the corrective action really helped to better train and better provide resources for both families and case managers and district reps throughout the district. As a result of that, ISB continues to monitor CPS special education via their enhanced general supervision plan. But ultimately, the way that it can support families is, Laura Bodeker is an ISB, she's an assistant legal counsel for the Illinois State Board of Education, but she's an appointed monitor to CPS. So she focuses on monitoring policy and procedure within the district, and families can reach out to ISB Monitor at isb.net, and the link is listed here, at any time with any questions. And you can also ask to remain confidential if you're concerned. So it's a good, again, when you're going up the ladder, when you really need support, always consider ISB as an option as well. Let me just make sure here. And again, feel free to put any questions in the chat box as we're going through. Okay. So who do I go to for special education support? Ideally, you can reach out to your principal, your assistant principals within your building. Each building should have a case manager, and the case manager roles really differ based on each school. Some schools may have a case manager who is a part-time special education teacher within the building, and others may have a dedicated case manager who's really dedicated to compliance, IEP, scheduling IEP meetings, making sure that the IEP data and et cetera is provided to families 3 days in advance of the IEP meeting, et cetera. So the school will have general education teachers and special education teachers, sometimes referred to as LBS 1. That's a certification for a special education teacher. And schools sort of interchange the use of the word paraprofessionals and SECAs. SECA, again, is the special education classroom assistant, but essentially the aides within the building. So if you're having challenges within your local school building, if you're hitting some barriers with your case manager, or if you're concerned that there are some misunderstandings, again, at the central office level, at the administrator level, there are district representatives and special education administrators that are available to you and your team to reach out to. So in some situations, a district rep is actually required to attend an IEP meeting. And for example, it might be if they're allocating the resources and the funding, if the team is determining a placement in a therapeutic day school. It's also important to remember that a district representative can provide support to the team and guidance to you and the team. However, they are not an IEP team member. So they should not be blocking team decisions. They should not heavily influence team decisions. And so, like I said, they can provide guidance to your case manager. They can provide information on what supports are available within the district that maybe your case manager is not aware of. And you, as a parent guardian, can reach out to the district representative at any time for support. And the special education administrators, the C role, they provide instructional support to teams. And typically, traditionally right now, they provide support if a school-based special education teacher reaches out, or if the case manager reaches out. But we want to make sure families know that the C is available to families as well at any time to reach out. And there's a link there where it's updated, should be updated regularly. And you can search for your schools, DR and SCA there. There's typically 1 or 2 per each network. And we'll go through here some examples of some challenges that may arise and some possible solutions. So for example, if your school's principal is calling you daily and they're asking you to pick up your child from school due to behavioral needs that the student is having, first of all, that is considered an informal suspension, and they should not be asking you to do that. You should ask that it be documented as such. But you can also request that the team contact the SBSS team for support. So that's the Student Behavioral Strategy and Support. And that's a team that is district-wide and at the department level within ODLSS, and they can do a couple of things. They could send a BCBA, a board certified behavioral analyst, out to the school to do an observation, to provide support to the team in starting an FBA, which is a functional behavioral analysis to determine the antecedent, the reasons that some of these behaviors are arising. And they can support the team in creating a BIP, if needed, a behavior intervention plan. They also have RBTs, so they're registered behavioral technicians that are available to come out and either observe, or they can be in the classroom and model interventions for the school team, and just sort of help the school-based staff implement behavioral interventions to ensure that your student is receiving the support and services that they require, and not just having the principal call you to pick up your student daily. Again, feel free to jump in, ask any questions, or put in the chat as we're going through. Let me just check here. So another issue that may arise is your child's team is not consistently working with their AAC device, their augmentative communication device, throughout all settings. So this is a situation where you could ask your case manager, or you can reach out directly to the ATRC team. So that's the Assistive Technology Resource Center team. And they have things available like AAC coaches that could come out to the school and observe and collaborate with the existing school team to show them, help model and show ways where they can integrate communication throughout the daily setting, which is required. Another example may be that your school case manager is denying an IEP, despite your school team, your special education teachers, and your general education teachers really advocating for such. A case manager might say, well, we don't need an IEP because there are no academic goals needed. So it's important to remember that an IEP can provide goals in areas other than just academics. For example, there's social emotional, independent functioning, executive functioning goals. This is a scenario which, if you're really hitting a wall with your school case manager, you can reach out to your district representative to help provide guidance to the team. So you may run into a situation where the case manager is saying that they need an excessive amount of data to show the need for an aid. For example, let's say your child is eloping from the classroom and you're concerned about their safety. ODLSS uses a paraprofessional justification form. It's a form to input data that helps show the need for a para support. It's important to remind the team that there is no set amount of data required for the team to make a decision on paraprofessional support. And again, and I'm seeing in the chat box, what's your recommendation when the DR is making the final decision, even if the team feels XYZ is needed and the DR is blocking the team? So that's a really good example of the nuances within CPS. Sometimes the district rep role can provide great support to your team, especially if your case manager is in a situation where they're being the one who's blocking. Other times, depending on who the DR is, they are going to just continue to block as well. So it's not helpful to have their support. I think it's important to just always kind of go back to that reminder and to look at, so that might be a situation where you alert the ISB monitor, but also kind of to just push back and let the DR know that while they are there to provide support, and for example, if the team is deciding on a therapeutic day school, the DR does need to be present to allocate the resources for that, but they cannot influence or make a decision or block the team decision. So there are, to add to the complexity, we've kind of systemically expressed some concerns with the level of training with district reps and why it's so inconsistent. And now they have district rep managers. So there is one manager for all of the district reps who are in elementary school, and then another manager for the district reps who are at the high school level. And, that's really where they're trying to be more consistent in the training and support that the DR provides. But I think if you're reaching a block, that's where you could reach out to the ISB monitor, explain what's happened, and see if they can help get involved to provide the support. And I think too, that's one of those situations too where you can sort of look up the organizational chart. That's important for, say, the CEDO to know that those situations are happening. And again, it's hit or miss, because sometimes the district rep involvement, like say, for example, a team is trying to push a student to a cluster classroom and it's not appropriate. Sometimes the DR getting involved can help show the team what can be done at the neighborhood school level to provide support to the student so that they don't need to be in a more restrictive setting. Can be very different experiences based on the district representative that's supporting you and your school. Wish I had a better answer for that. So ultimately, the DR cannot make a final decision. It is the IEP team who makes the decision, and then the DR simply allocates the funds. So if they are saying things like, I, as the DR, cannot allow this team to make the decision for, let's say, therapeutic day school, because you have to exhaust all of the other options available within the current setting before you can go to the more restrictive setting. It is not a requirement to sort of go through all of the ladders of LRE and try and fail at each one before accessing what you and the school team feels the student needs. So again, really the district rep role is not to block. They are not a decision maker, and that should not be happening. Sort of embedded in here is the ISB inquiry and the corrective action. And that would be a great page to review to see how this has kind of been an issue within the district previously. And I think that's where, if you're concerned about efforts that the district rep is trying to guide or control, reaching out to the ISB monitor or reaching out to their manager would be helpful. So some other options that may arise, for example, if your student's in a cluster classroom placement and you've received a school assignment letter, typically the school assignment letter comes via hard mail. It's typically not emailed. I don't know about you, but I'm not always eyes on my mailbox. So sometimes a school assignment letter can arrive after the date that you have certain amount of time to accept or deny the school placement. So it can be challenging, but you do have a right. For example, you might get a school assignment with a school listed that has a school that is very far from your home, and your child requires a lift or an elevator, and this school doesn't have that. So you can request a new school assignment. You can email the placement office, and their emails were earlier in the presentation. It's helpful to express your concerns with the placement that you've been provided and request a new school assignment. And these are just some examples of challenges that may arise. Your school bus route, your child's bus route is over 90 minutes each day, which is fairly common within the district. You can call the ODLSS transportation line. I will say sometimes the people that answer that line don't have a lot of specific information, aren't always specifically helpful. So I do suggest emailing the transportation director, and her email is earlier in this presentation, or the CEO and the CEDO, and request that your child's route time be reduced. So per Illinois State Board of Education guidance, the route time should be 60 minutes or under. And be prepared that when we're expressing concerns with transportation within CPS, sometimes their stock answer is to offer you to waive your right to the related service of transportation and accept a stipend. It's a financial incentive that they are offering for you to transport your own child. instead of resolving the issues or the roots, that tends to be the response that a lot of families get. And it's just important to note that if you're able to take them up on their financial incentive, the stipend is up to $500 per month. A lot of months it's actually significantly less, based on the number of days that your students are in school. The checks can be slow to be, they're sent to your local school, then the clerk has to delineate and you sort of get them to families, so it can be really challenging. But you can opt back into a route at any time during the school year. Ideally, though, your ride time should be 60 minutes or less. There are some options to file an ISB complaint, et cetera. But I think here I would suggest, emailing the transportation director directly and sort of just going straight to the top with questions. And there's a link here on some transportation information. And I think here we can, there's some resources, including Matt's book. There's firm resources. We have quite a few past webinars, and there's some CPS links here. So for example, the CPS and the ODLSS websites, there are multiple pages on special education, and unfortunately, currently they have conflicting information on it or outdated PDFs and et cetera. So it can be really challenging to navigate that, but happy to open it up here for any questions that anybody might have. Here, I'm going to stop sharing. You can go here. Feel free if you'd like to enter anything into the chat box, or I can see a question here about the DR wanting to move up a 3-year eval. And I think that that's a really good, that's a really good option, because it's a good question. If the district representative wants more current information, say like in a psychological evaluation, I would just be questioning, why do you feel like that's needed? Is it going to help provide the team with data that eventually helps inform the decision for a therapeutic day school? Or, or what is the goal in moving up that 3-year evaluation, et cetera? And I think it could be helpful to ask, do they feel like the disability category needs to change? What's the premise behind that? Because if the team has already made or if they've implied that the decision is that the student needs a therapeutic day school and they're hitting a wall with the district rep, again, you're just not required to move up that evaluation. Schools should not be calling SAS as well. If they're calling SAS for behavioral support, they could be calling the SBSS team. Also, we do see a lot of concerns with overuse of calls to SAS, DCFS or 911 within the district. And I think that sometimes teams think, if I can show this, this kitchen sink of bad behavior or really exaggerate it, then I can prove the need to whomever, and that's sometimes that district rep role, that we need XYZ services. And unfortunately, that's a very CPS based thing, and it's not necessary. Yeah, I would, and I think in that situation, I would reach out to ISB, to the ISB monitor, because the district representative should not be blocking any decision making by the team. I think this fall we're seeing a pretty strong return to that within IEP meetings. I think it can be really challenging. And again, so there are different departments within CPS. There's the CPS law department as well. And sometimes what we do is just highlight that we're experiencing a situation in which a district representative is either delaying or denying a team decision, and that is very inappropriate. So. Just make sure. And anybody feel free to unmute if there are any other questions. That was a lot of information with a lot of acronyms in a very short amount of time, so I apologize. So here I will put the ISB monitor email, and that is so the ISB monitor, Laura Bodeker, is, like I said, ISB still has what they call their I think it's like their supervision plan. So they've moved from formal corrective action to an overview of supervision of CPS special education, but the ISB monitor is still in her role and available. And again, I think that you can ask to report, situations confidentially and ask her for support, but essentially Laura is certainly aware of concerns that may be going on. For example, if a DR is blocking a decision. Yes. So observations within the classroom and in CPS and ODLSS. So first of all, you are absolutely allowed an observation within a classroom. They do have a specific form, but you will experience quite a bit where either an administrator or a case manager will say that you can't observe your student in the classroom. And they'll say either that it's due to it might be like a violation of you be able to identify other students in that classroom who may be receiving special education supports. So that is not correct. And also there is some confusion, some valid confusion. CPS sometimes requires families who are going to be in the school to be a level 1 or a level 2 volunteer. You are not required to go through the level 1 or level 2 volunteer process to be able to observe in your classroom. You are required, however, to fill out the form. The school team can dictate when you're observing. They can dictate the amount of time that you're observing, or they can state that they might have the principal there as well while you're there, so that whatever you see, they're seeing. And it can be, so they have some control over the when and the where and the amount of time of the observation, but they cannot block the observation. So that might be a good situation in which you reach out to your district rep for support in being able to observe the classroom. And anyone feel free to unmute. I hope you guys can unmute if you need to, if you have any additional questions. And we'll be sending this presentation will come out via email, and then it'll also be available on our website with our other webinars and presentations. Let me see, I'll put that up in the chat box now. So that's a really good question, Nicole. So the ODLSS form to request an observation has changed. And part of that was we've sort of expressed as advocates concern with why it's getting confused with just being a volunteer in the classroom, and how families need to have access to observe and not have to go through the same process of becoming a level 1 or a level 2 volunteer within CPS. Let me see if I can find here. So the other thing, here's one way to navigate finding some of this information. You'll find that individual school websites, like for here, this is Rudolph within CPS, they've linked the form to request an observation. So some of the individual school websites have a lot of great information for families of students with diverse learners. But again, it's just difficult to find that on the CPS website or the ODLSS website. But there's one example of the form, and you can see that you can sort of walk through why you're requesting the observation and why it's important to be able to observe the programming. This also comes up as well when, you know, you have a right to observe whatever classroom or whatever programming is being proposed by the district. And it can be really challenging, for example, if your student's being identified for a cluster placement and you want to be able to observe specific schools and specific programming because they're different. Sometimes the district will tell you that you don't have the option to do that, and that you'll just receive a school assignment and then you can decide after. And so it can be really challenging when it comes to observations of programming within the district, but you do have a right to observe, and both in the current school setting and any proposed settings. I'll just go through and see if I've missed any questions here. And so the SBSS team, the Student Behavioral Services and Support team, and I think I use Student Behavior Strategies and something, they also have a different manager now. So I was hoping to get that direct email, and I'll try to follow up after and update the presentation. Erin Miller was the previous manager, and they've gone through different processes throughout the years to access that team's support. 2 years ago, you know, post-COVID closures, you had to request their team observation through your case manager. That case manager had to have an FBA and a BIP already in place. It had to be implemented for 6 weeks, and there was a long wait line of students. We've expressed concern with that, and that's no longer the process. You as a family member or the team can reach out to SBSS directly at any time to request support from their team. You know, they can be incredibly helpful, especially when it comes to providing behavioral support for our students. They have, you know, 3 or 4 positions that are still vacant. We really want the district to beef up that department and provide more supports to families, but it can be a challenge. The SBSS team also has trainings. So many of them are virtual trainings available to special ed teachers, aides, etc. They are also a venue for a vessel to receive restraint and timeout training. You can request additional safety cares training, etc., for your school's team through them. So they can be a really great support. And I think sometimes it takes the family reaching out directly and pushing for support for the team. And again, the way that the SBSS team works with your local team is to make sure that they have buy-in first. They do a very nice diplomatic job of working to make sure the team understands it's an added support. If that makes sense. So. Yeah, and so in regards to full-time case managers, so this is something unique to CPS. In the past, you might have a case manager who has a caseload of 150 students, and it's very difficult to schedule all the meetings and to be on top of what the student needs are. And you'll see that in different schools, that case manager has different roles. Sometimes the case manager is strictly just doing the paperwork and the compliance of the IEPs, running the IEP meetings, but doesn't have a lot of understanding of this day-to-day for the student. And in other situations, the case manager knows the ins and outs of their student's day, their schedule. They can really participate in the IEP meetings and provide support to their school team members. It's hit or miss depending on the school setup, but the Chicago Teachers Union did during their strike, they did I think they obtained full-time case managers. There's a formula for it. It's like if you have 100 and more IEPs, your school is allocated a full-time case manager. However, by the end of 2024, I believe, each school is set to have a dedicated full-time case manager. So those are some things that are unique to CPS as well. You know, how you get a dedicated case manager, how you get a dedicated nurse. All of these supports are much needed by all of our schools, but there's various ways that you can help advocate for your local school to have the resources that they need. And we touched a little bit on attending LSC meetings, your local school council meetings. We're also, I'm happy to help support any family members or advocates who would like to start a diverse learner committee, a special education committee at their school, and that may be under the LSC. And that can be an opportunity to express concerns with needed dedicated case managers or get dedicated nurse within the school team, or just making sure that the school has the resources that they need. And it can be a challenge because sometimes you might have a case manager that's new. We're also seeing some district representatives that are new, and it can feel like you're sort of just constantly having to advocate strongly, but there are resources to provide support. And of course, if you ever have any questions or concerns, you can reach out directly to our office. We're happy to help. Let's see. Feel free. Anybody else with any questions? Looks like we're right at 1 o'clock now. I'm happy to stay on for a little while longer, or we can conclude the webinar. All right, guys. We'll stop it there, I guess. Thank you guys so much. Have a great afternoon. It was great to be here today.